Welcome to The Alternative Investor. My name is Nastasia Arendse, and today we're going to be looking at private equity. It's a source of investment capital from high net worth individuals with the goal of investing and acquiring equity ownership in companies. The investment in those companies will generally be made by a private equity firm, but also by a venture capital firm or angel investor. In simpler terms, the idea behind private equity is to gather up funds from a number of investors, take those funds and use them to acquire a controlling or substantial minority position in a firm, and that get a return on your investment. To discuss the private equity landscape in South Africa, we're joined by Tanya Van Lill. She's the CEO of the South African Venture Capital Association. Tanya, thank you so much for your time this afternoon.
It's my pleasure.
So let's talk about the landscape in South Africa when it comes to private equity. What does that look like?
So the private equity landscape, private equity in South Africa is about 30 years old. There is currently 171 billion in assets under management managed by various fund managers, and each of them have a different investment mandate. So in other words, they determine which industries, which types of companies and which geographies they invest in. What we're seeing is that the industry is definitely displaying a lot of growth, and a subset of the private equity industry, as you mentioned in your introduction, is venture capital. And venture capital, on the other hand, in South Africa is still a very young industry, still being established. And although we're seeing a lot more increased activity and investment activity, it's still not yet at the levels where its big brother, the private equity industry, is.
Let's talk a little bit about some of these companies that private equity, firms would be exposed to. What kind of sectors are they, and what would they be typically looking for?
So each fund manager has their investment mandate. Depending on their investment mandate, they then raise funds from third parties. And as you said, it could be high net worth individuals, it could be pension funds, sovereign funds, endowment funds that they raise money from to invest in companies. And the types of companies they'll invest in is privately owned companies. And these are companies, depending on the life cycle of the company, if it's a younger company, more early stage kind of investment, venture capital fund managers will invest. But as a company starts to grow and mature and need more capital to fuel the growth, you'll see private equity fund managers investing. And the types of industries that they invest in, it's dependent on their investment mandate. But what we've seen in investment activity last year is that some of the top industries that received investment were in the services space, retail. We saw a lot of investment going into energy, healthcare, as well as infrastructure projects.
Right. You gave us a little bit of information in terms of how long the private equity industry has been alive in South Africa for, but how does it compare when we look at our emerging market peers or perhaps some of the regional players?
So in the region, on the African continent, South Africa or the Southern Africa region is definitely the biggest player on the continent. We're seeing a lot more investment activity happening in Southern Africa, although there's an increase in activity in East and West Africa. If we compare ourselves to the other emerging markets, South Africa compared to the other BRICS, if you look at our investment activity as a percentage of GDP, we invest just under 1% of GDP in investment activity in the space, whereas you'll find in China it's much smaller, it's 0.18%, or in Russia it's hardly there's hardly any private equity activity. But if you compare us to the more developed markets, such as the UK or the US, we're fairly small in comparison, but sizable on the continent.
Right. Let's look at some of the work that you do as the Venture Capital Association of South Africa. Talk to us a little bit more about that.
So at SABC, we aim to be the voice for private equity and venture capital in Southern Africa, and on behalf of our members, promote the value that the asset class offers through impact and associated research. We also do a lot of advocacy work, and we assist our industry with capacity building and assist where we can in terms of transformation of the industry.
Right. Let's talk about transformation. What sort of advances are you seeing when it comes to the percentage of females and perhaps, black players in that market?
If I look at it 10 years ago, the number of black-owned fund managers in the space was about 14%. We're now sitting at around 40% of the funds under management or funds being managed is by black players, which is a sizable improvement from 10 years ago. But what one also needs to consider is that private equity funds have a 10-year lifespan and sometimes a 12 or 15-year lifespan if it's an infrastructure fund. So it does take time to transform in terms of the ownership level, but we're glad to see that there's so much progress that's been made. Where we do see there's a big gap and there's a more need for progress is on gender, as only about 9% of the funds that are members of SAFCA are actually women-owned funds. So there's a lot of initiative and focus on more gender-balanced investing in this sector, but also in the financial sector as a whole.
Right. You were talking about the venture capital side and mentioning that it's quite a small sort of a nascent market in South Africa. Why is that?
So venture capital is a bit of a risky asset class, and it also requires specialist expertise and skills, and people who are willing to quit a day job or quit a very comfortable corporate career and start a venture capital fund. So not a lot of people have had that courage yet to do. So we've seen that the venture capital fund managers that have been established, they have anything between 10 and 15 years in experience. And we're seeing more venture capital funds being established. But it takes time to build the ecosystem itself. So we need more venture capital fund managers to be established. But in order to do that, there also needs to be more institutional money to flow to venture capital funds.
What are some of the challenges that the industry is experiencing? I can imagine the current climate, the economic environment that does tend to have an effect.
Well, currently a lot of the focus from our members is on supporting the investee companies or as they call them, the portfolio companies that they are invested in, to make sure that these companies survive the crisis, they've got the necessary access to liquidity, and where necessary they need to pivot their strategy. So a lot of their focus and attention is on supporting their current portfolios. However, they still need to balance that with either fundraising or with looking for new investments. So the challenges that we suspect in the next 18 to 24 months is going to be on the fund managers that are fundraising, because a lot of the institutional investors are also focusing on their current portfolios, and it may increase the length of time it will take for fund managers to fundraise during this period.
Tanya, thank you so much for your time. That is Tanya Van Lill, who is the CEO of the South African Venture Capital Association. Moving on to news out of the crypto space, the Bank of England is reviewing whether it should create a central-backed digital currency. The Bank of England is part of a group of major central banks teaming up to assess potentially developing their own digital currencies, acknowledging their role has been challenged by new technologies and private sector initiatives such as Facebook's Libra. Meanwhile, Bitcoin continues to trade around $9,200. That's it from me. I'll be back with you tomorrow with Books on Point. But for now, we have my colleague Nzinga Guntao at the top of the hour with more of your news. But for now, here were the details.